The iron tang of dust and gunpowder hung in the air as Ethan Blackwell stared down at the blank sheet of paper before him, the ink in his pen untouched and threatening to dry out. His weathered hands, more accustomed to rope and reins than quill and parchment, trembled slightly as he considered what words might possibly fill this emptiness, an emptiness that matched the hollow feeling in his chest since Harriet Evans had left Pine Creek, Colorado 3 weeks prior. The year was 1878, and Ethan had never written a letter in his 30 years of existence. Not when his parents died of fever back in '64. Not when his brother joined the Union Army. Not when anyone or anything had come or gone from his life. But something about Harriet's departure had changed everything. "Damn woman," he muttered, pushing back from the small table in his cabin, the chair legs scraping against the rough-hewn floorboards. The sound echoed in the quiet space, reminding him just how alone he truly was. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across his modest ranch. 6 years he'd worked this land, built it from nothing into something worth having. 6 years of solitude and hard work with only occasional trips into town for supplies and maybe a drink at the saloon. Then Harriet had arrived last spring, the new schoolteacher from Boston, with her fine manners and even finer blue eyes. Eyes that had somehow seen past his rough exterior to something he hadn't known still existed within himself. Ethan paced the length of his cabin, 3 strides one way, 3 back, like a caged mountain lion. He picked up the pen again, dipped it in ink, and held it poised above the paper. "Dear Miss Evans," he wrote, the letters awkward and childlike. He hadn't properly written since his own brief schooling ended at 12. He stared at those 3 words for nearly 10 minutes before adding, "I hope this letter finds you well." The formality of it made him grimace. It wasn't what he wanted to say at all. With a frustrated grunt, he crumpled the paper and tossed it into the cold fireplace. Morning came with no progress made, but a determination had settled in Ethan's bones. After tending to his horses and cattle, he rode into town, a journey of nearly an hour across open country that gave him too much time to think. Pine Creek had grown in recent years, boasting a proper general store, a saloon, a small church, the schoolhouse, and various other establishments necessary for civilization to take root in the frontier. Ethan tied his horse outside the general store and nodded curtly to Mrs. Patterson as he entered. "Well, look what the wind blew in," she said cheerfully. "Haven't seen you in nearly a month, Mr. Blackwell." "Need paper," he said simply. "And envelopes. Good ones." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Writing letters now, are we?" Ethan merely grunted in response. "I imagine you might be writing to our dear Miss Evans," Mrs. Patterson continued, undeterred by his silence, as she gathered the requested items. Such a shame she had to leave so suddenly. Her mother taken ill and all. Boston's an awful long way from Colorado. Ethan hadn't known that detail. Harriet had simply told him she was leaving, standing on the porch of the schoolhouse after classes had ended for the day, her eyes downcast as she'd spoken the words that had hollowed him out. "How long will she be gone?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "Hard to say. She mentioned she might not return at all if her mother's condition is as serious as the telegram suggested." The news hit Ethan like a physical blow. Not return? The thought hadn't occurred to him. He'd been operating under the assumption that her departure was temporary, that she would come back to Pine Creek, to the children who adored her, to their conversations on Sunday afternoons when he'd deliberately find reasons to pass by the schoolhouse where she lived in the attached quarters. He paid for his purchases and walked out into the bright sunlight, squinting against its intensity. Across the street, Sheriff Miller raised a hand in greeting, but Ethan could barely manage a nod in return. Back at his ranch, he sat once more at the table, fresh paper before him. This time, he didn't hesitate. "Harriet," he wrote, foregoing formality. "I heard about your mother."
"I'm sorry."
I hope she recovers quickly. He paused, the pen hovering. What else could he say? That he missed her? That the sight of her walking down Pine Creek's main street with her blue dress swaying around her ankles had been the highlight of his otherwise solitary weeks? That their conversations about books and ideas had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead? Instead, he wrote, Pine Creek is quiet without you. The children miss their teacher. He couldn't bring himself to say that he missed her too. Such admissions didn't come easily to a man who had spent most of his life communicating with horses and cattle rather than people. He signed it simply Ethan Blackwell and sealed it in an envelope before he could reconsider. Tomorrow he would take it to be posted. For now, he had a ranch to run and animals that depended on him, regardless of the ache in his chest. The next morning brought unexpected company. As Ethan was finishing his morning chores, he spotted a rider approaching Edward Evans, Harriet's younger brother, who had arrived in Pine Creek only months before his sister's departure. The young man was 22, eager to make his fortune in the West, and currently working at the town's bank. Morning, Blackwell, Edward called as he dismounted. Hope I'm not disturbing your work. Just finishing up, Ethan replied, wiping his hands on his worn jeans. Something wrong? Edward shook his head. Not wrong, exactly. I received a letter from Harriet yesterday. She asked me to check on a few things at the schoolhouse, prepare it in case a replacement teacher arrives. He hesitated. She also asked about you. Ethan's pulse quickened. Me? Yes, Edward said, a slight smile playing at his lips. She wondered if you were keeping up with that book she lent you. Thoreau, was it? Walden. The book sat on his bedside table, half read and dog-eared. He'd been reading it slowly, savoring it because Harriet had pressed it into his hands with such enthusiasm. Haven't finished it yet, Ethan admitted. She'd be glad to hear you're still reading it, Edward said. I'm heading back to town now if you'd like me to post any letters. His eyes flicked to the envelope sitting on the porch railing. Ethan hesitated only briefly before retrieving the letter. Much obliged. After Edward departed, Ethan found himself unable to return to his chores. Instead, he sat on his porch, Walden in his hands, and began to read where he'd left off. Thoreau's words about living deliberately in the woods struck him differently now, reading them with the knowledge that Harriet had asked after him. That evening, he wrote another letter. I'm still reading Walden, he wrote. Thoreau says, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately. I think I understand that better now. My ranch isn't so different from his pond. But lately, I've been wondering if living alone is the same as living deliberately. He paused, surprised at himself. He'd never spoken such thoughts aloud, let alone committed them to paper. But something about writing to Harriet made the words flow more easily than he'd expected. Your brother says you asked about me. I'm doing fine. Ranch is doing fine too. Had a good spring with the calves. He wanted to ask when she might return, if she would return at all, but couldn't bring himself to be so direct. Instead, he concluded with, Pine Creek awaits your return. As do I. He signed it and set it aside to post the next time he went to town. Days passed, then weeks. Ethan fell into a routine of writing to Harriet every few days, sometimes just a few lines about the weather or his ranch, other times longer reflections inspired by his reading or observations. He never received a reply, but Edward occasionally brought news her mother was improving slowly. Harriet was considering her options. Boston society was welcoming her back as if she'd never left. Each bit of information was both treasured and troubling. Ethan found himself filling pages with thoughts he'd never expressed before, knowing they might never be read but feeling compelled to write them nonetheless. Summer faded into autumn, the aspens turning golden on the mountainsides. Ethan continued his letters, now filling a page or more each time with increasing ease. He wrote about the changing seasons, about the books he was reading. He'd finished Walden and moved on to other volumes borrowed from the town's small library, about his hopes for his ranch and the new techniques he was implementing based on articles in agricultural journals. What he couldn't write was the truth that had become increasingly clear to him. He loved her. The realization had come to him gradually, like the changing of seasons, until one morning he woke with the certainty of it settled in his chest alongside the ache of her absence. In early October, as the first frost silvered the grass, Edward brought news that chilled Ethan more thoroughly than any winter could. "Harriet's engaged," he said without preamble, standing awkwardly in Ethan's doorway. "To a banker in Boston. An old family friend." Ethan stood perfectly still, feeling as though he'd been shot but somehow remained standing. "I see," he managed to say. "When's the wedding?" "Spring," Edward replied, looking uncomfortable. "She's not returning to Pine Creek. She asked me to pack up her belongings and send them east." Ethan nodded mechanically. "Congratulate her for me," he said, his voice hollow. That night, he sat with pen and paper as usual, but no words would come. The blank page mocked him, as empty as his future now seemed. Finally, he wrote a single line, "I wish you happiness, Harriet." He signed it, sealed it, and placed it with his other unsent letters in a wooden box. The next morning, he rode into town and posted every letter he'd written over the past months, all except the last one. That one, he burned in his fireplace, watching as his brief wish for her happiness curled and blackened in the flames. Winter descended on Colorado with its usual ferocity. Ethan worked from dawn until dusk, exhausting himself physically in hopes of quieting his mind. He stopped writing letters. What was the point? Harriet was engaged to another man, a man of education and means who could give her the life she deserved in civilization, not the harsh existence of a rancher's wife in the territories. Christmas came and went without celebration. New Year's passed with Ethan alone in his cabin, a bottle of whiskey his only companion. January brought heavy snows that isolated him further, forcing him to focus solely on survival and the welfare of his livestock. It was during one particularly violent blizzard in late January that Ethan, returning from checking on his horses in the barn, thought he heard a noise at his door, a knocking almost lost in the howling wind. Assuming it was a branch torn loose by the storm, he was shocked to find a snow-covered figure huddled on his porch when he opened the door. "Dear God," he muttered, pulling the person inside without hesitation. Only when he'd closed the door against the storm did he realize who stood before him, shivering violently beneath layers of snow-crusted clothing. Harriet. She pushed back her hood, revealing her face, paler than he remembered and pinched with cold, but undeniably her. "Hello, Ethan," she said through chattering teeth. He moved quickly, stoking the fire, wrapping her in blankets, and preparing hot coffee while she huddled near the flames. 1,000 questions raced through his mind, but he forced himself to wait until some color had returned to her cheeks. "You should not be traveling in this weather," he said finally, handing her the steaming mug. "It's dangerous." "I had no choice," she replied, her voice stronger now. "I needed to see you before I made a terrible mistake." Ethan sat across from her, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain she must hear it. "Your engagement," he said. Harriet nodded. "I received your letters, Ethan. All of them. They arrived all at once, just after Christmas." She took a sip of coffee, her blue eyes never leaving his face. "Why did you wait so long to send them?" He shrugged, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "Didn't think they mattered much." "They mattered," she said softly. "They mattered very much." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. "I broke off my engagement," Harriet said finally, "after reading your letters. 3 years I lived in Pine Creek, and you barely spoke 10 words together to me until that last month before I left. Then I received these letters." She shook her head in wonder. "I never knew you had such thoughts in you, such dreams." Ethan shifted in his chair. Never been much for talking. But you write beautifully, she said. Raw and honest in a way few men ever allow themselves to be. She set down her mug. Your words made me realize that I was about to marry a man whose conversation was pleasant, but whose soul I would never know as I've come to know yours through your letters. Hope, dangerous and fragile, began to bloom in Ethan's chest. What are you saying, Harriet? She moved from her chair to kneel before him, taking his rough hands in her smaller ones. I'm saying that I've made my choice. I've come back to Pine Creek to you if you'll have me. For a man unaccustomed to expressing his feelings, Ethan found himself suddenly unable to find words adequate to the moment. Instead, he pulled Harriet gently into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that conveyed everything he couldn't say. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers. Stay, he whispered. Not just tonight. Stay for good. Harriet's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. I intend to. The blizzard raged for 3 more days, keeping them snowbound in the cabin. They passed the time talking, really talking in a way Ethan had never done with another person. Harriet told him about Boston, about her mother's illness and recovery, about her brief engagement to a man she'd known since childhood, but never truly loved. Ethan, in turn, shared stories of his life that he'd never told anyone: his childhood in Pennsylvania, losing his parents to fever, making his way west after the war with nothing but determination and a talent for working with horses. He spoke of his dreams for the ranch, of the improvements he wanted to make, the legacy he hoped to build. And in the quiet moments between conversations, when words failed him, he would take out pen and paper and write his thoughts to her, even though she sat just across the room. It had become his way of ensuring she understood the depth of his feelings, the sincerity of his intentions. When the storm finally broke, leaving a world transformed by snow and ice, Ethan knew his life had been similarly transformed. Harriet stood beside him on the porch, her hand in his as they surveyed the glittering landscape. It won't be easy, he warned her. Ranching life is hard, especially for a woman used to city comforts. Harriet squeezed his hand. I spent 3 years in a frontier schoolhouse with nothing but books for company. I'm tougher than I look. The town will talk. Coming back unmarried. Staying here with me. She turned to face him, her expression determined. Then we should give them something proper to talk about, shouldn't we? Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What are you suggesting? Marry me, Ethan Blackwell, she said boldly. Not because of propriety or what others might think, but because I love you, and I believe you love me too. Ethan had never been a man for grand gestures or flowing speeches. But in that moment, with Harriet looking up at him with such hope and courage, he found himself dropping to one knee in the snow, still holding her hand in his. I love you, Harriet Evans, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. I've loved you since you first talked to me about Thoreau and made me see my solitude differently. I'd be honored if you'd be my wife. Her yes was barely audible, but the kiss that followed left no doubt of her answer. They were married 2 weeks later in Pine Creek's small church, with Edward standing as Ethan's best man and Mrs. Patterson beaming in the front pew. The entire town turned out for the occasion, collectively pleased that their former schoolteacher had returned and that the solitary rancher had finally found his match. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it new life and possibilities. Ethan and Harriet worked side by side, expanding the ranch house, increasing the herd, and planting a vegetable garden that soon became the envy of neighboring homesteads. Harriet started a small school on the ranch for the children of nearby families, combining her love of teaching with her new life. And every night, without fail, Ethan would write sometimes just a few lines, sometimes pages documenting their days together, his thoughts, his growing love for the woman who had changed everything for him. It became a ritual, one that Harriet treasured almost as much as he did. Why do you still write when I'm right here beside you? she asked him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. Ethan considered her question carefully. "Writing helped me find my voice when you were gone," he said finally. "Now it helps me make sure I never take for granted that you came back." Harriet leaned her head against his shoulder. "I'll always be glad I came back. And I'll always be grateful you did," he replied, his arm tightening around her. As the years passed, their family grew. First came Elizabeth, with her father's quiet demeanor and her mother's bright blue eyes. 2 years later, Samuel arrived, loud and strong from his first breath. The children thrived in the freedom of ranch life, tempered by their mother's insistence on education and their father's lessons in responsibility and hard work. The letters continued, filling box after box as the seasons turned. Sometimes, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Harry would ask Ethan to read from his earliest writings, the letters he'd penned when she was in Boston. They would laugh together at his awkward first attempts and grow quiet at the depth of feeling that had emerged as his confidence in writing grew. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Harriet presented Ethan with a leather-bound journal, his initials embossed in gold on the cover. "For the next chapter," she said, kissing him softly. That night, as Harriet slept beside him, Ethan opened the journal and wrote on the first page, "10 years ago, I didn't know how to express what was in my heart. I was a man of silence and solitude, comfortable with horses and cattle, but lost with people. Then Harriet left, and I found that words could bridge distances I couldn't cross on horseback. I filled pages with thoughts I'd never spoken aloud, sending them east like prayers on the wind. I never expected those words to bring her back to me. Never dared hope that the letters I wrote in loneliness would lead to this life of fullness, a wife who understands me, children who amaze me daily, a ranch that flourishes under our combined care." A cowboy never wrote letters until a woman left and he started filling pages. "Now I write not from loneliness but from abundance, not to bridge a distance but to document a journey we're taking together. And I am grateful, every day, for the woman who taught me that some feelings are too important to leave unwritten, some loves too precious to leave unspoken." He closed the journal and placed it carefully on the bedside table before turning to gather his sleeping wife in his arms. Outside, the Colorado night was vast and star-filled, but Ethan Blackwell no longer felt small beneath it. In finding his words, he had found his place in the world, not alone on the frontier, but connected by love and family to something greater than himself. And as he drifted toward sleep, he was already composing tomorrow's entry in his mind, another page filled with the simple, profound joy of a life once solitary, now shared.